This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. I would like to acknowledge that the University of South Australia meets on the land of the Kaurna people. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. I extend that respect to Aboriginal peoples from other areas of South Australia and Australia. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia to our event, The Domino Effect, Climate Change and Pandemics. We are co-presenting this event with The Conversation and the Embassy of France Australia, and I would like to thank both of these organisations for their wonderful work. Also to thank our speakers for their contribution and for sharing their unique insight and expertise in tonight's discussion. This event is being recorded and a video will be available on the Hawke Centre website. We encourage you to bring this to the attention of your friends and colleagues who could not join us online. I'm sure you will find tonight's presentation thought-provoking and insightful. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Misha Ketchell, editor of The Conversation, to introduce our guest speakers.
Today's discussion is looking at the links between COVID-19 and the climate and biodiversity crisis. All animals harbour viruses and other pathogens, and when environmental pressures force them into contact with humans, the results can be catastrophic. Environmental damage can also make humans more susceptible to the effects of infectious diseases. Governments have demonstrated they can take immediate, radical emergency measures to protect well-being. And yet, despite being declared a global emergency, the world has largely failed to address climate change and the environmental effects of our pursuit for economic growth. These are the issues we're going to tease out today. The format for this discussion is that we have three eminent panellists, and I will introduce them one by one, and they will each speak for about 5 minutes. After everyone has spoken, we'll move on to a moderated discussion. I'll be asking questions and I'll also be reading questions that have been sent in by audience members. To start with our first speaker, Dr Jean-François Guégan is the Director of Research at the Institute of Research and for Development in France. He is a research professor with the highest grade in France in parasitology and ecology of infectious diseases at INRAE and IRD. The former is the National Institute in Agronomy, Nutrition and the Environment, and the latter one is the National Institute for Research on Sustainable Development. He is also a professor at the French School of Public Health, where he is leading a course track in environmental health. For the past 20 years, he has been interested in the consequences of environmental changes, climate change, loss of biological diversity and habitat changes on infectious disease transmission and emerging diseases. His work is focused on the transmutation of measles and whooping cough, cholera, avian influenza, and West Nile virus. He is currently working on Burley ulcer, also called Bairnsdale disease in Australia. Professor Guégan, you wrote a recent article for The Conversation that discussed the power of viruses to cross the species barrier. Are we doing things that increase that risk? And if so, what should we be doing differently?
Good afternoon to everyone. So definitely we are increasing the risk of new emerging infectious disease all over the world, notably in the tropical world, because with habitat alteration like deforestation in large number of countries today, like in Indonesia, like in many countries of Southeast Asia and Central Africa, and in Brazil, for instance, we are also making that those species that are embedded into these biomes have their spatial range to decrease. So many more species are coexisting today in pockets of spaces in those forests. So viruses and bacteria can switch on new host species. And when human populations are present, so viruses and bacteria can switch on those human individuals as well. So habitat alteration, like deforestation, is strongly important in explaining the process of emerging infectious disease due to the new coexistence of species today in those spaces.
Talked in your article about sort of this underworld of microorganisms that could emerge. Can you tell us a bit more about that and what threat they pose?
Sorry, I didn't understand the questions.
In your article that you wrote for the conversation, you talked about the idea of sort of almost an underworld of potential viruses that could pose a threat to us. What did you mean?
So you are referring. So I got the point. So you are referring to my article in the conversation in France. So I am explaining that there are two worlds. The world that you can observe, you can watch. Made of macroorganisms, elephants, giraffes, buffaloes, and even human individuals as well. And there is also the underground, the world that constitute what we call today the dark biodiversity, the world that you cannot watch, which is made of billions of and myriads of microorganisms, microbes that you cannot watch at all. And the two worlds coexist today. But the fact that we are more impacting onto biodiversity, impacting on pristine habitats like rainforests, for instance, we are more and more put into contact with the underworld that is made of myriads of microbes. So we generate by ourselves and by our human activities this exposure to new microbes that naturally exist or that are totally embedded into natural ecosystems. And this is really what happens today.
Is there an increase in the number of zoonotic viruses, so viruses that move from animals to humans?
Yes, there are two processes. We observe more and more what we call zoonotic infections in humans. It means microbes coming from wildlife animals and domestic animals as well, switching onto human individuals. And the total number of zoonotic disease has increased the 60 last years, definitely. The proportion of zoonotic disease today is near 75% of infections that are caused by animal disease and are responsible for causing disease in humans. This is the first explanation. The second explanation is that we have observed during the last 30 years also an increase of epidemics and the frequency of epidemics that are happening today. It has increased, and so it makes that epidemics are producing, waves and waves, and this has increased during the last 30 years as well. So the volume of infections caused by animals is today much more important, and the frequency of epidemics that happens, like the COVID-19, this is an illustration of this process, are happening more and more with a bigger frequency of events.
So what do we need to do to reverse those trends? Like, how do we stop that increase in epidemics?
This is an interesting question, but this is also a complex question because, if you look at what happens all over the world, and let's take the example of a virologist, for instance. We have plenty of virologists, but the virologist needs to have the virus getting out from the wood in order to study it. This is the same for bacteriologists. They need this object to study this object. So many researchers are waiting the virus. So they need that an outbreak, an epidemic, and even a pandemic happen in order to study and understand the virus and its spread. So what we do need today is, instead to develop a downstream research approach, is to tackle the virus before it emerges somewhere. So we need to develop an upstream research approach in order to understand what happens in the different local conditions that generate this emerging infectious disease. And this is a huge concern today for research. Of course, for research, but for the human civilization today, because we need absolutely convert, the research from a downstream research approach to an upstream research approach, tackle the problem at its source.
Okay, and part of that source that you've mentioned is the loss of habitat and biodiversity more generally. So you've got species sort of crammed into smaller spaces. Do you have any thoughts on what can actually be done about that?
Oh yes, of course. Human activities, are always responsible for the genesis of infectious and parasitic disease. This is we as human individuals and human civilization, we generate and reproduce, and we produce the previous infectious disease and the current infectious disease, and we are producing through our activities like land use changes, for instance, deforestation for the development of agriculture on Erdene, for instance. We are producing these new infections. Let's take the example of the bacterium responsible for causing whooping cough. It is also called pertussis, which is a human infection, but it exists in human as well, a different species, but it produces quite the same disease. The bacterium that is responsible for causing this infection in animals and in humans is first a bacterium from the roots of some gramineae. And people contracted this bacterium with the first development of agriculture somewhere in Mesopotamia 8,000 years ago, when they started the development of agriculture. And this is the process that is today happening, but at a bigger scale. And it happens in tropical regions of the world because we are impacting onto these pristine natural biomes like the rainforest, for instance. So we are putting, human individuals, the farmers, for instance, into contact with the underworld through this process. So, the alteration of natural habitats, the alteration of biodiversity is a strong process in the genesis of these new infections through the development of agriculture, like the production of soybean in Brazil or palm oil tree in Indonesia, for instance.
Yeah, so it sounds very much like, to a large extent, it's our fault. We're sort of responsible for many of the circumstances that has caused the spread of these viruses. That does raise the very interesting question of how we can respond in a way that reduces that risk, because it would be a big thing to change the way we do agriculture or, the way in which we do so many things sort of as a species. Do you have any sense of what's possible in terms of a sort of a broader policy response?
This is a complex question, complex solutions as well, because we totally need to convert our way of thinking about emerging infectious disease. If if we decide as a civilization to wait for the next vaccines, the production of vaccines is totally a random process. We know, for instance, for human, near 45 different vaccines on a total number of 2,200 different infectious disease and parasitic disease in human populations all over the world. So if you calculate and made an estimation of the total success of production of vaccine, this is less than 2%. And nobody is explaining you the total massive number of errors that have been produced in order to succeed in the production of a vaccine. So, I mean, production of vaccine is totally a random process, in fact. So if we are just waiting for a new vaccine, it can be produced, but I'm explaining to you that the total number of errors is much more important than the total number of success. So if we are just waiting for a vaccine, I mean, this will be dramatic for human, for the human civilization. So we need totally to reconsider our point of view about emerging infectious disease, emerging threats, because if we do the same, we will have new epidemics and pandemics coming recurrently. So we need again to tackle the beast at the source, because we generate through our activities these new emerging threats. So we need to work on the ground with the population in order to help them to develop their agriculture. Of course, this is very important because we need to produce food for the people.
Okay.
But in the same time, we need to calculate and estimate the risk that this way of agriculture development can generate risks in order to minimize this risk. Okay.
Okay. That sounds like
this is the way science needs to be done today.
It sounds like a big task.
Yeah, this is a big task. This is a civilization task and civilization issue, because new emerging threats will happen in the future for sure.
Okay. At that point, I'd like to bring in Dr. Natasha Shussain, who is a writer and researcher in sustainability and wellbeing. She's an Adjunct Research Fellow at Swinburne University of Technology's Centre for Social Impact. Natasha has worked on sustainability issues for the past 11 years. She holds a PhD looking at the concept of bon vivre as an alternative to sustainable development, and has a book coming out later in the year on that topic. And maybe, Natasha, I could start with that question. What is bon vivre, and have I pronounced it correctly?
Hi, Misha, and hi, everyone. Well, first of all, I'd just like to begin also by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, and also pay respects to the elders past and present. And I'd like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So to answer your question, bon vivre, that was a very good pronunciation. Bon vivre is a Latin American philosophy. It emanates from a worldview from the Andes, and originates in Indigenous people from the Andes. It really looks at a holistic way that we can achieve sustainability and well-being. And this is done by a view that's more biocentric than something like sustainable development. So it's recognising this vital connection between the health and well-being of nature and our own health and well-being. And so one of the biggest lessons, I think, that we've learnt from coronavirus is this connection, how deeply we are connected to each other and to the earth. And as a society, we need to internalise this more and more mindfully, and through our actions and choices, to make sure that we have both a strong and healthy community and also a healthy environment. So bon vivre is a people-led idea. So it's really about change coming from the bottom up rather than the top down, which is what sustainable development is about. But saying that, it's important to recognise that there's a symbiosis between policy and society, because we can't achieve ecological sustainability and well-being alone. So we also need effective and supportive policies. And this means that policymakers for the future, if we are going to recognise this connection that we have with the environment, they'll need to incorporate that into more sustainable policy, more effective climate action. So one way that this is done in several jurisdictions, like Ecuador, for example, is through the recognition of legal recognition of the rights of nature. So Ecuador introduced, as part of its constitutional reform in 2008, the rights of nature into its constitution. And this went hand in hand with a policy for Buen Vivir. So Buen Vivir is also implemented at the policy level in Ecuador and Bolivia. So really it's about making those changes from the grassroots and the bottom up level change, but having them met by effective climate policy.
Okay, and what do you think the chances are of that in Australia currently? Is that something that you are optimistic about? Do you see that there's sort of a movement for a more effective climate policy?
I always like to be optimistic because otherwise our work here is done. We have no further business in trying to fight for climate change action. But, so far the Australian government haven't shown a great level of support for climate action, either at the community level or in high-level policy. So we really need some drastic action towards this if we're going to make any positive changes.
Many people have said that they think that the response to COVID-19 has represented sort of a paradigm shift in terms of the ways in which government and society are responding to expert evidence and dealing with very real threats that could be translated to some extent in the way that we deal with climate change. Do you think that's the case? And if so, how can that sort of precedent be seized and put into play?
I feel like a lot of people have seen the benefits of a slower way of life that has come from the changes from coronavirus. And many people are saying that they don't want to go back to the normal, because the normal was always the problem. So that's where ideas like Buen Vivir come in. But we can certainly use the lessons learned from coronavirus to help tackle climate change at both the policy level and the societal level. Really the pandemic made us pull out the emergency stop brakes in society. We could clearly see the way that the crisis was heading and that we needed to take urgent action. And so both governments and people, implemented that action. And the slowing down of life globally has resulted in this slowing of the economy. So some say that this is an unintended degrowing of the economy. And this has had both positive and negative consequences. And the negatives are things like, massive job cuts and a jump in unemployment rates globally. And pandemics and climate crises alike hit the most vulnerable first and the hardest. And they act as poverty multipliers because of the way that they force people into extreme poverty. So these negatives really highlight the inherent problems with the current economic system. And so we've already seen problems like this arise with the global financial crisis, and that whenever there's a crisis, the whole system goes into chaos. And so there have been some positive impacts, and things like, life slowing down. People have realised that greater leisure time, more time with family, they really understand what really matters in life beyond economic growth and wealth accumulation. So There are also environmental positives, like in the first 4 months of the pandemic, emissions dropped more than 1 billion tonnes from the same period in 2019. And the International Energy Agency estimates a 5% drop in emissions in 2020. So this means that if we continue on this trajectory, we'll reach net zero emissions, which is the target for 2050. So the thing is, though, even this is a little bit too much too late. And a 2019 UN emissions gap report said that to keep warming closer to 1.5 degrees, we need to drop emissions by 7.6% per year until 2030. So in terms for action for climate change, the consequences of coronavirus provide us with a chance to reset. So reset our lives, reset the economy, reset our way of doing things. And that's where ideas like degrowth policies come in, which is intended degrowing the economy. So unlike the unintended degrowing of the economy that's happened from coronavirus, degrowth is always about intentionally degrowing the more environmentally damaging sectors of the economy, and then putting more emphasis, focus and growth into the more socially and environmentally stable sectors of the economy, like healthcare, sanitation, education, sustainable technologies, renewable energies, and reskilling workers, finding full employment opportunities for workers in green jobs. So by having effective policies and investing more in people and environmental focused industries, and less in things like extractive industries, we won't only have positive runoff on climate, but also make us more prepared to tackle any future pandemics and any crises related to climate change. So while we have a need for a shift in policy, we also have a need for a behavioural shift towards collective action and collective wellbeing and away from individualism. And this is what we've started to see during coronavirus. You've seen communities coming together, people focusing more on their families, their communities, their friends, and the well-being of their social networks. And so it's this strengthening of solidarity and a shared sense of humanity, and that we're all in it together.
It does seem to me that if you look at the current sort of policy settings or the political leadership, there is a real doubling down on the idea of getting back to business as usual because of the huge economic impact. And in actual fact, rather than sort of a reset, it seems like we're moving on a slightly different path. But I'll come back to that. I'd like to introduce Fiona Armstrong into the conversation now. Fiona is the founder and executive director of the Climate and Health Alliance, a coalition of health groups with a mission to build a powerful health sector movement for climate action. She has a background as a health professional, journalist and public policy advocacy. A recent article in The Conversation, Coronavirus is a Wake-Up Call, Our War with the Environment is Leading to Pandemics, highlights the link between climate change, biodiversity loss and the coronavirus pandemic, which is what we've been talking about entirely so far. She's the co-author of a global call to action for health professionals in the new book, Health of People, Health of Planet and Our Responsibility, launched by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences on the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si. So Fiona, just to bring you into it, how do you think the disruption that's come from COVID-19 can help us understand the shortcomings of our pre-COVID world and help us actually reset?
Thanks, Misha, and hi everyone. I'd like to follow Natasha's lead and also acknowledge traditional owners of the land on which I live and thank them for their custodianship and express my regret at our failure to date to acknowledge their wisdom and insights and sovereignty, and express my hope that that will change in the future, and personally commit to taking action to support that. I think that is a very important issue that so many people are thinking through right now. The notion of going back to normal or resetting to business as usual is really sending shivers down the spine of people around the world who are collectively working and fighting for climate action, knowing that we're going through simultaneous global emergencies, which are the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. So we simply can't ignore those underlying crises since they're interconnected. And if we continue to ignore them, they're only going to create larger problems in the future. So we must use the opportunity that's provided by this disruption to reset and head on a different course to restore the conditions that recognise the interconnectedness of our own health and well-being with that of, you know, the wider environment, and bringing in the notion of planetary health, that we rely on the natural world to create the conditions that allow us to live healthy and sustainable lives. So it is an opportunity to think about building back better, you know, is the kind of notion that lots of people are talking about, beyond the hashtag, but really thinking deeply through what are the changes that we need to make economically, socially, culturally, to tackle the structural inequities that existed prior to the COVID pandemic, and to tackle the environmental and biodiversity crises that have contributed to the COVID pandemic. So disruption of this kind provides a unique moment for us to reflect on how we got here, and to use the opportunity of the lockdown that's still occurring in many parts of the world, or certainly the slowdown, that before we invest in the economic stimulus to try and help our economies recover, that we make sure that we're investing in ways that are going to enhance our resilience economically, environmentally, and socially in the future. So there's no room in our economic recovery measures that are going to plunge us further into crisis. And climate change poses the most serious threat that human civilization has faced. We're rapidly heading into the kinds of conditions that are going to make large parts of the world uninhabitable. I mean, for example, this week, the temperatures in Siberia reached 30 degrees Celsius, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is unthinkable in that part of the world. And we've experienced the black summer of bushfires, where we've come face to face with the health impacts of climate change. So, you know, we really need to think carefully about the policies that we put into place as we move forward, including tackling social inequities and the kinds of conditions that have trapped so many people, particularly young people, in insecure jobs and forced them to accept inadequate wages and conditions. So we can't be short-sighted as we think this through, and we need to be investing for the longer term while we tackle the short-term economic pain. And the reality is that investing in the solutions that will help tackle those underlying crises, strengthening our health systems, investing in environmental restoration, create many more jobs than investing in the fossil fuel economy. So there's an opportunity really to build back better in a very vigorous way that's going to tackle both the short-term pain that we're in and help to set us up well for the future.
Sure. Can I just push you a little bit on that? Because I think one of the difficulties that any government faces is that we know that the economic impact of COVID-19 has fallen disproportionately on people who are already disadvantaged in many ways. And any government, you know, quite rightly feels a huge imperative to get people back into jobs. And that can translate very quickly into get them back into any jobs at any cost. The idea of actually engineering a reset in that process when the idea of getting people back into jobs is so pressing, it seems to me that any sort of nuance about what sorts of jobs or what sort of economy currently is being lost. How do you actually inject that sort of reset idea into the discourse? Like, how do you actually get that to take hold in a meaningful way?
Well, it's definitely a challenge, but I guess the opportunity that we have is that a disruption of this kind does provide an opportunity to encourage people to think more deeply and creatively about the future, including policymakers. So the social research tells us that in times of disruption, people are willing to consider more radical change than they might have been willing to in the future. However, that window is relatively short because, people do feel anxious about change and they feel insecure. So they want to go back to normal, even if normal wasn't ideal. So there is an opportunity at this time to think differently about how we plan for the future. And I think we need to, in some sense, address the imagination failure that has proved such a barrier to taking action on climate change in the past. So we need to engage in a process of dreaming that future, in a sense, to imagine our possible alternative futures and to contrast where what the consequences are of the choices that we might make that will take us in a different direction. So much of that the conversation around climate change has been around what's the difference between 1.5 degrees and 3 degrees, or what's the difference between 350 parts per million and 400 parts per million. And I think largely the community and many policymakers, those numbers are meaningless. So we need to find ways to describe in tangible way that people can relate to in their everyday lives what those differences look like and what are the steps that we need to get there. And I think, the slowdown that's occurred through the COVID-19 pandemic has provided people with an opportunity to start to look around them and rediscover some of the things that matter in a local community, whether that's walking and cycling or exposure to nature or growing food, and really making the point very clearly that investing in those opportunities in the urban planning and neighbourhood renewal that will help deliver us those things in the longer term are also strategies that can lead to reductions in emissions and boost our health and well-being, increase community resilience, help reduce social isolation all at the same time. So I think it's about selling that more positive vision, which genuinely exists, but hasn't really been very well presented to people to date.
I'd just like to start putting some questions that were sent in by some of our audience members. One of the questions that was sent in was this: scientific evidence has played a big role in the COVID-19 response from many governments. Why do you think expert advice on the pandemic has been accepted when expert advice on climate change is so often ignored? Does anybody want to have a go at answering that question? I think it's a curly one.
Well, I guess the scientific evidence in relation to COVID didn't rub up against vested interests in quite the same way that tackling climate change does. And I think, we need to be very upfront about that it really is those that have a vested interest in the status quo are proving to be the most significant barrier to action on climate change. So when it came time to consider the health of the population, there was, a very clear indication that action was needed, and there wasn't a vocal, opposition to investing in healthcare, because generally across the community it was recognised that the community interest in the case of a pandemic relates to self-interest. And so, people have been willing to support the kinds of actions that lead to the curtailment of individual freedoms and, business as usual, because there was a sense that, we would all otherwise individually and collectively suffer as a result.
Natasha, did you want to add anything to that?
I think absolutely. It's a question of vested interest. Really, to effectively tackle climate change, it means we will have to change the status quo. This has been acknowledged widely, and not just by radical activists, but also by economists and also by policymakers. But there's just this lack of willingness to do anything about it that is effective long-term, because it would also mean having to think about something other than economic growth. So the way that well-being is currently measured globally for the most part is by GDP. And I think it scares policymakers to think about something other than measuring how society is progressing, other than using economic growth as an indicator.
I've got another question from an audience member, which says, at an individual level, the pandemic brought huge behavioural changes that are good for the environment. People stopped travelling, started growing their own food, and made do with less. Once restrictions are lifted, will many of these new ways of life persist, or will people just want to return to their pre-pandemic ways? Jean-François, maybe you could answer that question a bit for us, because when you were speaking before, you were talking very much about the idea that we need to do some things that are quite radical in terms of altering our behaviour. Do you think we will at least be able to hold on to some small changes after the pandemic, and will that be a place that we can start?
Complex question. So I have no direct solution to propose. I think that people all over the world, and even research needs to change their viewpoint on research on such topic. So I'm sure to be able to reply to this question that evidence-based science today concerning COVID-19 doesn't show, the existence of relationship between climate change and COVID-19. There is nothing that is happening between climate change and COVID-19. The main driver of COVID-19 emergence and spread has much more to see with illegal trade of bushmeat for pangolins. So, the big problem we are facing today as science researchers on science is that we need to produce evidence-based research, and not to say that in this case climate change has something to see with the spread of COVID-19, because there is no demonstration at all. And we need to take care of that, because many researchers which have a much more mechanistic approach. So searching for the exact cause producing an effect. And this is what molecular biologists are doing. They are telling us, you are explaining things, but it looks like blah, 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 because COVID-19 has nothing to see with climate change. So there is a disruption today inside science as well. Because between people who are looking for the exact cause of responsible for causing a consequence, and if you want to do that, you need to do experimentation, and you can develop experimentation at the lab and only in the laboratory. Okay, so you reduce the temporal and spatial scales of your studies. Okay. And the problems that are happening today are global threats, global problems, and you cannot put the planet and its problems today into the lab in order to study it. So there is a big schism. Do you say this in English? Schism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Between inside science as well. So. For me, this is a very important moment as for science as well.
Yeah. Okay. Fiona, do you have any thoughts on that? These are big planetary issues that transcend. I mean, there's the issue about, the zoonotic viruses, which is linked to loss of biodiversity. And then we've got all of these sort of climate change issues as well. And there's really a need, potentially, it seems like everybody's saying, to change the way, at a planetary level, we look after the planet. How do you think you can get that done?
In some ways, it depends how long those behaviours and changes remain in place. So if the conditions remain in place long enough that changes in behaviour become a habit, I think it is possible that we'll see, expectations and behaviours change into the future. So if we have an ongoing situation where travel is curtailed and social distancing becomes the status quo, it may be that we do see the kinds of behaviours associated with that around slowing down, localisation, growing more of our own food, having more low carbon lives. Those practices become embedded in our daily lives and also in our expectations of others. So given that peer behaviour is very influential, the extent to which others are engaging in those behaviours, practices determines the extent to which we ourselves adopt them.
I've got another audience question which I'd like to put to the panel. This one is about a quote from Jane Goodall, who said that humanity is doomed if we do not radically alter our relationship with animals. Can the panel reflect on the destructive snowballing effects of our farming practices and suggest ways of operationalising change? Is anybody able to talk to specifically farming practices and what we might do about them?
I mean, this is a part of my of my research work. I mean, so yes, definitely. I mean, agriculture. I mean, I'm speaking about intensive agriculture as we see its development in many parts of the world. So I know many parts of the tropical world, for instance. I mean, Cameroon and Central Africa are facing, big concerns with deforestation, the transformation of this pristine rainforest environment on their conversion into big fields for the production of palm tree, the production of palm oil. This is the same that is happening all over Brazil and in the Amazonian basin as well, and the same in the southeast of Asia, many countries in this part of the world. So. And this massive alteration of this natural habitat strongly affect. The natural ecosystems. The animal communities that are embedded into these natural ecosystems. And through this process, it's modified ecological communities with a phenomenon of cascade of effect, making that the microbe can increase in population size, and then when people are put into contact with this microbe, they get it. They can get it, and it develop a new infection and a new disease. And this is what happens. The deforestation in Brazil has been responsible for an increase of not an emerging disease, but a re-emerging disease, which is malaria. With in between 20 to 30% more of malaria cases in some parts of regions of Brazil due to deforestation. And this is what's happening all over the tropical world today. So, deforestation is through a cascade of effect phenomenon. And this is the same with bull ulcer. Bull ulcer is called a Barnsdale disease in Australia. And you have this disease in the southwestern part of Australia, Victoria, is it? Yes, in Victoria region. And bull ulcer and the development of mycobacterium, this is a bacterium that is responsible for causing the disease, is strongly associated with this process of deforestation and the modification of landscape through the impact on natural ecosystem and human encroachment on settlement. And this is what happens in Australia with the development of new settlements by people building new cottages in some areas where the microbe is present. So they get the microbe.
Fiona, I think you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think the question points to the destructive nature of industrial farming, where animal health and animal rights are being compromised. And that intensive scale of farming is also very emissions intensive. So it's not only bad for animals and creating an ethical dilemma for people who are consuming animal products, but it's also environmentally destructive, as John-Claude is pointing out. So it leads to extensive land clearing and is emissions intensive and contributing to climate change. So there's a reason that there's a discipline called One Health, which recognises that human health and animal health are intertwined and interdependent. And it's very closely associated with eco-health and planetary health. But unfortunately, it's only quite emergent in modern public health thinking, even though the concepts are ancient and timeless, essentially. It's certainly something that we're trying to highlight through our work, that our health is dependent on the health of the natural environment. And so the message is really we need to protect nature so that nature can protect us.
Okay. So we're going to have to wrap up in a minute. I'll just throw to Natasha first, and then I'll sort of go to each panellist for any sort of closing thoughts. But Natasha, you wanted to add something on that first of all?
So just on that, what Fiona was saying about the intertwining of human and animal or nature, we have, from a legal and political perspective, we have a lot of mechanisms to protect human rights, but things like implementing the rights of nature in constitutions or local laws and ordinances, national laws, that would go a long way to protecting animal rights, because it attributes legal rights to animals, to all living beings really, so it includes anything in nature to exist and flourish. So things under the rights of nature, it's would attribute like legal duties not to cause suffering of farm animals for human consumption. So this would come down to 5 basic freedoms, for example, the discomfort, hunger, distress and fear, pain and injury and disease, and for animals to be able to express their natural behaviour. So I think there is something that can be done on a legal and political perspective, if not nationally, globally. There's also talk about introducing an international declaration for the rights of nature. So that might help answer this, or connect our human and natural well-being.
Can I just challenge you on that just a tiny bit, which is it seems to me that whenever a notion about the rights of nature comes into conflict with an idea about rights of human beings, the rights of human beings will always take predominance, and perhaps maybe argue justifiably. So, for example, in the context of COVID-19, the government priority is very much getting people who have lost their jobs and their livelihoods back into jobs, perhaps with limited regard to what those jobs are. How could a right of nature coexist with all the other obligations and rights that governments have to pay heed to?
Well, it's not about either or. It's about recognising that nature has the right to exist and to flourish. So that when you think about things like extractivism, that means, of course, governments will argue that extractive policies are necessary for economic growth, so that goes towards human well-being. But then there are other flow-on effects from this, from nature and to human well-being. So humans can then advocate for nature. For example, in Ecuador, there's been cases where mining has been detrimental to the environment, but also these flow-on effects go back to the communities. And so it's really about this intertwining of natural and human health and how that is balanced out.
Okay. Look, we're just almost out of time, so we have to start wrapping up. So maybe I'll just give everybody just a chance to sort of make any final remarks, raise anything that you we haven't touched on that you'd like to. Perhaps starting with Jean-François.
Yes, so we discussed about biodiversity and the interactions between biodiversity, natural habitats like rainforest and humans and human civilization. But we always spoke about, species richness, species diversity. But we need to consider the genetic background of these species as well, and notably those that we produce as crops, gramineae, on the domestic animals. Let's take the example of what happens, and I'm quite sure that this happens in Australia as well and all over the world, is that people are eating upon 6 to 7 different gramineae in France. So we produce these seeds and for the production of wheat, for instance, and each of these cereal gramineae species produced in France, so 6 to 7. In past time, there were more than 8 different species, and we totally lost this in our recent history. But coming back to the 6 to 7 species of gramineae that we produce to provide, food for the French population, or European population as well, each of these species have only one race. Okay, so making that if this race of gramineae produced in France is facing a big threat, like a virus circulating around, because these plants are also susceptible to viruses, bacteria, and fungi as well. If one individual is susceptible to this virus, all the fields will be susceptible to these threats, because we totally eroded the genetic background of the species that we produce. So we need to take care of this, because famines will come in the near future. So we need to reconstruct and reconsider these genetic backgrounds of the vegetable, the gramineae, and even the animal races that we use as domestic stock, for instance. This is strongly important. Let's take the example of what happens in Africa today. There is only one race or variety. We say variety for plants, a variety of rice. Only one. 30 years ago in Senegal, you were able to find 130 different varieties of rice, and each one were totally adapted to the context, to the environment, to the climate, to the absence of rainfall, etc., etc., etc. And today there is only one. And the seed is a production coming from Thailand. But today what happens is that they are suffering a lot from a virus, destroying all the rice field culture in Western and Central Africa. So you can imagine the big problem that will happen in the near future. So the genetic background is a good way in agriculture to reintroduce resilience to these new threats. And this is very important to consider, instead of looking and trying to, through technological processes, to try to reconstruct some vegetable and even animals that could be adapted to this new context.
Fiona, do you have any final thoughts?
Just to go back to your initial point, Misha, about policymakers listening to the science in relation to COVID and why don't they listen to the science on climate change? I guess what this experience demonstrates, that when political will, is directed to addressing a public health crisis at short notice and on large scales. It can be done. So this is the kind of effort that we need to tackle the climate crisis. And my hope is that, given that there's an overwhelming chorus of calls that the pandemic's our opportunity to build back better by investing in the kinds of policies that mean that we also tackle the climate crisis. Because without that, we don't have an economy and we don't have a future. So there's so much evidence that this is going to create more jobs, many jobs, that will be better for our health, will create more jobs than our current extractive economy. So let's just hope that that's what we choose to do.
It sounds from what Jean-François is saying, like we could employ some people rebuilding sort of diversity of, genetic background of crops and species, for example. That might give us some greater resilience.
What a wonderful idea.
Yeah. Natasha, do you have some final comments?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that it's they're not in isolation of one another. They're two intersecting crises, coronavirus and climate change. And so we really have to take into our focus how they are connected and our connection to nature, and implement that not only in policy but also in daily life.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. That's a fantastic note on which to end, a note of sort of, to some extent, personal responsibility, I think, as well. Thanks to all the panellists. That was a terrific conversation. I learned a huge amount, and I'm slightly less ignorant, I hope significantly less ignorant than when I started. So thank you very much for your time, everybody. Thank you, everybody who's been watching. We really appreciate you sending in questions and continuing to pay attention. So thank you very much, and bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.